Hi, good morning, or good afternoon, in fact, and welcome to the latest and indeed last in a series of webinars that have been hosted by the Tower Centre and Columbia Journalism Review on the portentous subject of journalism in crisis, which is a project that we are conducting of research and publishing around particularly the COVID pandemic, but which look at some of the structural issues that we've had in journalism for the past few years. I'm really pleased actually that we're finishing, if you like, with this panel, because I've got three people here whose work I've followed and engaged with over a long period of time, who've all been looking, if you like, the big picture issues of journalism. In other words, we know that something isn't quite right, and we want to fix it. My name's Emily Bell. I'm director of the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism. My co-host is Kyle Pope, who is the editor-in-chief and publisher of I've got this Columbia Journalism Review.
I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's been a long time since I've seen you in person, Kyle. And on our panel, we have Heather Chaplin. Heather is the founding director of the Journalism and Design program at the New School. She's an author and journalist in her own right. She co-hosts a very successful podcast, which is currently resting with myself, called Tricky, where we talk about the difficult problems facing journalism. Welcome, Heather. We have Professor Letrell Crittenden. Letrell, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. Letrell, as well as being, I'm delighted to say, a fellow at the Tower Centre, he's been doing some really wonderful work for us in looking at inclusion and journalism in both urban and rural communities. Letrell is also program director and assistant professor of communication at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. And he's also a former police and government reporter. So it's great to have you here, Letrell. And then last but not least, we have Elizabeth Green. Elizabeth is the founder and editor-in-chief of Chalkbeat. She's also, I was going to say in her spare time, but it's not technically in her spare time. She's also part of the American Journalism Project, which is founded by John Thornton, the philanthropist who's behind the Texas Tribune, and Elizabeth is leading an effort there to figure out how we can reconstruct local journalism in America from the ground up. So we have people with us who have really studied the breadth of the field and not just identified lots of problems, but also come up, I think, with solutions. Because I'm happiest, or rather most comfortable asking Heather awkward questions, I'm going to start with her. But I really wanted to kind of get from the panel, first off, some big picture thoughts about, where do you think we are in this process of, if you like, crisis and rebuild, and how do you think the pandemic is affecting it? And then maybe kind of what you're seeing in your own work, what you've been observing recently. So Heather, it's a small question for you to start with there.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you want me to kind of like give a whole spiel and then move
around?
Sure.
Okay. Sure. Give us the internal workings of Heather Chaplin's brain at the moment in terms of the state of journalism, which I know is something you think about quite a lot.
Well, I guess to answer that as directly as possible, I would say it's really bad. I think everyone here knows, but I'm constantly struck by how much even people who work in the field don't really realize how serious the crisis is. Emily and I have talked about this a lot, but specifically the last couple of years, I think the private equity firms coming in and buying up newspapers to stripping them down to parts means we really are looking at a scenario where there might not be any newspapers left in a couple of years, or if there are newspapers left, they're going to be ghost papers that it would almost be better to have nothing. I'm sure you all have seen that, Pew's recent study that 70% of Americans don't think there's anything wrong with the newspaper business. So there's this big disconnect, but I think it's dire. In terms of like a sort of big picture perspective, I guess I would suggest that it might be worthwhile to start with some sort of diagnosis of the problem, and so that we know what it is we're trying to solve for, because I know you want to be getting at what we should be doing right now since we are in this crisis. And so I guess the thing that I always try to say is that it seems really important to remember that the problem, the challenge we face is not how to save or recreate newspapers as they've existed in the past or in the 20th century, but what might a flourishing free press look like in the future? And that those are two really different things, that a flourishing free press is not synonymous with 20th century newspaper industry. And I make this point, one, because you got to know what the disease is before you try to develop a cure, but also I find my chest sort of swelling with hope when I think about this, because if you've been studying this problem, you might feel like your face is up against a brick wall. How do we save this dying thing? How do we save this dying thing? And you can't get any movement no matter where you go. But the minute that you realize, wait, my job isn't to try to save this thing, but my job is really to reinvent this new thing, the possibility space expands exponentially. And there's suddenly our job becomes to be incredibly imaginative and creative and to understand, A, what does the free press that we want look like? And two, what conditions need to be in place for that to happen? And that's a much more exciting problem to be working on. And then just to get even bigger from that, I do think it's worth asking, why do we even need this thing, and not just to fall back on, oh, democracy requires it, because like, what does that even mean? And I think it's important to think about the free press as being part of the even playing field that a democracy requires, as some kind of protection from exploitation, that knowledge is power. And at the end of the day, the fight for the future of the free press is all about power and who has it and who doesn't, and how do we redistribute it a little bit more fairly than it is right now. So then the goal is not save local newspapers and save journalist jobs, but building this system that fulfills those things I just said. We need to ask, what are the attributes of this ideal system and what conditions need to exist? Now, Emily, I can keep going and go in depth, or do you want me to stop there?
No, that was an absolutely great introduction to a lot of the themes, and it's actually a very good moment to come to Letrell.
Yeah.
Because Letrell, a lot of your work is like literally sort of looked at the kind of granularity of what Heather has just been describing. I was really struck by her phrase that, you know, we're not really about saving things, we're about trying to create something completely different, which, you know, if we're not starting from the point of view that the 20th century free press was an ideal model, in fact, it was anything but. Can you tell us about, you know, what your thoughts are about that, and particularly how it relates to your work in the field and what you're seeing? Because you've identified some really interesting kind of issues around inclusion and thoughts about like how we should start to approach that in very different communities.
And I'm glad you mentioned very different communities. I'm actually hopeful for the future. One, I do believe that the old school model is breaking. The question is, what are the models now that provide the best pathway for the future? And my research actually focuses mainly on 3 areas in Pennsylvania. And I think that you can get a lot of lessons out of those particular areas. Broadly, and I'll start with broadly speaking, I think that when COVID hit, Philadelphia, where I live, is a perfect model for, I think, what can potentially happen. Philadelphia as an ecosystem has a number of news properties, but they are heavily subsidized and helped out by foundation money. There's a lot of collaboration across different newsrooms, and there are a lot of different community newsrooms and also ethnic newsrooms. And a lot of that work is fostered by Resolve Philadelphia, which is a major success in collaborative journalism. And my project there, Germantown Info Hub, which focuses specifically on one neighborhood in Philadelphia, predominantly African-American neighborhood, is one of those partners in Resolve. And I'll certainly elaborate on it more, but we've immediately kicked into gear once COVID hit to say, how are we going to best represent and cover this community when we can no longer gather together? And I think that one of the things that we did was ours is a website, but we went immediately into radio. And we actually are now partnering with G-Town Radio, which I'm actually a board member of that organization. And we're creating a news show, and that has now been subsidized through a grant through LendFest. So that is, I think, one of the marvelous models of what's happened is that there are so many different newsrooms saying, how can we tackle this issue? Then you have a place like Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, which is another area where I'm focused on, where they have basically 2 newsrooms, really one, and you're talking about an area that is an emerging news desert. They only have a handful of journalists, and a lot of the news and content that is focused on Chambersburg is actually coming out of central Pennsylvania, another community, York, Pennsylvania, due to mergers with Gannett. So they actually have a dearth of local news and information that's focused on communities there. And it's significantly been problematic because at one point, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania was the biggest hotspot for COVID in the nation, but that was not reflected in local news coverage. So that is a significant issue. Then you have Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is in the third bucket where they recognize problems, they're trying, but we'll see what happens. They don't necessarily have the same type of infrastructure. There's lots of media, but you don't have a really strong collaborative presence. And as has come up in the news, there are a whole host of issues with how they cover different communities, particularly communities of color. And that a lot of the newsrooms have a complete disconnect with communities of color. So I think that trying to figure out what are the lessons from each of these particular areas is where we can start in terms of how can we move forward in the future. And I think Philadelphia is a solid model, but unfortunately, more and more places are starting to look like Chambersburg.
Right. So that's a great point at which to come to Elizabeth and Letrell. I want to come back at some point just to sort of talk about when we talk about local news. I think you've highlighted very well how no 2 places really looks the same, and actually places which are geographically quite close together can have totally different architectures, communities, etc. So this idea of producing something that works for everyone is going to be challenging. And talking of challenging, Elizabeth, you and I have talked, kind of quite recently actually about you're in the middle of actually trying to create structures that really address this. What are you seeing, and has the pandemic changed much of what you thought? Has it accelerated it? And we've had Letrell and Heather both saying they're pretty hopeful. What's your current state of the mood on this?
I'm like a good, healthy combination of terrified and hopeful, kind of at the same time, I would say. I think that I was just thinking as you were talking, Letrell, about what is our baseline for Philadelphia, for example. If Philadelphia is our good news spot in some ways, then what is the baseline what would success look like? And I kind of think that's one of my starting points here is what do we mean by success with American journalism? What would it be to be successful? And that from one entry point I have to this whole conversation is I cover education, decided to do that when I was 16 years old, been doing it ever since. I have a pretty clear idea from the lens of the what does it look like to have a healthy public education system in the US is one of the core functions of our democracy, right? So from that lens, I could say, okay, I think success looks like education is funded at the state level and the local level, and yet we have no very few dedicated journalists paying any attention to how funding happens. Funding decides what policy looks like, right? Budgets write reality in so many ways. And then, from there, school boards are deciding things like right now, who gets a laptop, who goes to school, who's going to teach whom. All these things need to be attended to by an independent press, and then connecting, decision makers to people. Like that's what journalism is all about, right? Like making the deliberative democracy cycle work, function, be responsive. If you scale that out, because there's not just education in this world, there's many other topics. That's what led me to co-found the American Journalism Project with John Thornton. There's so much more that we need to do to get to success than just to have education covered, of course. And I think that what it has to look like is a similar kind of analysis. We spend $3 trillion a year roughly at the state and local level of taxpayer dollars sort of creating the infrastructure of our public life. That's on not just schools, but public health, social welfare systems, criminal justice systems. How do we want that all to be? And so I guess, that I come at it from, let's first define that success for journalism means that all of these institutions in American life are actually functioning in the aspirational way of deliberative democracy, responsive feedback loops of what is going on in the community, and then letting people who make decisions for that community know about what the community thinks and wants, and also just like connecting those two people together. That's success. Then we have to put a price tag on success, right? Okay, how much will it cost for us to do that? That's what you and I talked about recently, Emily. And then the job is, let's find the money to do it as quickly as possible. And I think the money is, we're not even remotely there, but I can't think of a better moment in time to make the case for what is needed in Philly, in Germantown, the Germantown neighborhood of Philly, in Chambersville, and in Pittsburgh. Like in all of the cases, we need more resources, I think. And what's the path to mobilizing them, and how fast? Like this is the moment in time when I don't think anyone in our country has been more convinced that we need to be reconnected with our civic life in their lifetime than this moment, probably. And so I think now is the time to make the big case.
Right, that's a rallying cry. You posed the question, what does a healthy system look like? Heather, you've been studying systems. Sorry, Kyle, I haven't forgotten you. I'm going to bring you in a minute, but I know that Heather has something to say on what does a healthy system actually look like? I mean, is it one thing? Can it be systemic? Is it a number of things? Sorry, you're muted, Heather.
Sorry, I wish I had just a here's the answer, goodbye everybody, but I partly just want to thank Elizabeth for bringing that up. I think this issue that we don't have a shared vision for what the future ought to look like is a problem. And I've often noticed that we have no metrics for success that aren't about the industry's business success. We measure how much money, we measure circulation, but how do we know if we're serving our purpose? What would a metrics of success look like that was from the perspective of the people who need the newspapers, not from the newspapers going out? It's actually a really hard problem to solve. I've posted things about it. And, for example, voting, I always think newspapers should have to put how many of its readers vote, at the top of every page. But what might metrics of success look like? And how do we begin to develop a shared vision of what a healthy system looks like in the future, so then we can develop a theory of change of what we have to do to get there? Just a few quick things I would throw out that besides sort of the obvious things, is I do think that some sort of realignment of allegiance has to happen away from the way 20th century newspapers, I would argue, have essentially, whether consciously or not, been on the side of power. And how do you realign it that they're adamantly on the side of the people in their communities, all communities, to Letrell's point, and what does that look like? And also the issue of equal access. I'm always struck by how that doesn't come up in these conversations a lot. How do we develop a free press that has built into its DNA that everybody gets equal access to the information that they need? But I think you wanted to turn to Kyle, so I won't keep going on and on. Although
no, I think those are all excellent points. Actually, I wanted to bring Letrell back in there, but I will let Kyle actually, no, I'm not going to let Kyle have a go. I'm going to let him have a go in a second, because I just wanted to go to Letrell on that point that you made, Heather, about kind of, we don't have the metrics for success, and we don't look at those from the perspective of the communities that we are working within. And Letrell, this shows up in a lot of your work. It's certainly shown up in a lot of the research that you've done for us, which is, kind of you're dealing with communities that would not recognize what perhaps some people would say were, functioning or kind of, sort of healthy newsrooms as actually being anything which has ever sort of served them particularly well. So how do you go about kind of assessing that, kind of question of what is working for the communities and how differently you have to address them?
I'm glad you bring that. I'm actually working on another piece right now where basically what I'm trying to come up with is, for lack of a better term, a rubric for assessing the health of different ecosystems with an emphasis on communities of color. And I think that one of the main things that I have a problem with, and I appreciate the point of talking about social access and making sure that all communities are represented fairly, is that when we talk about the health of different ecosystems, we're not talking about, do they serve communities of color well? And in my research in Pittsburgh was based on, there was a report that came out that said Pittsburgh has a relatively thriving media ecosystem. But when you talk to people about what's happening in Pittsburgh inside of newsrooms and also in the community, there's a vast disconnect with Pittsburgh media and communities of color. And the argument I would make is, if you have an organ in your body or a part of your body that's not being served, then you don't have a healthy system. Whoops. And I think that's one of the things that was kind of like timely for a default like that at that point. But that's one of the things that I think we really need to look at when we're talking about, okay, what's the financial health? How many journalists are there? But are all of your community members being served equally? And that's one of the things that the Germantown Info Hub, the entire emphasis was on, this is a neighborhood, African-American neighborhood in Philadelphia, where people feel that they're not fairly represented. So the idea is to make sure that we bring their voices into the larger media ecosystem, in one that, quite frankly, again, is much healthier than others. But then when you get to Chambersburg, the situation is the entire ecosystem is dissolving because of job cutbacks, but you never had fair representation of communities of color in Chambersburg to begin with. So now you have that pressure of economic change that leads that no one feels they're being covered properly. But now you also have to deal with this fact that you never covered communities of color properly. Right. So I think that there has to be some way of measuring, as one of those sort of pillars, what is your connection to communities of color? And it has to also talk about, do journalists of color inside of those newsrooms feel that they have agency to impact any change, in addition to the level of diversity in newsrooms?
Yeah, because I wanted to ask you about that in the, we're sort of experiencing a, lightning rod moment in some ways in the overwhelmingly kind of white media, which generally kind of serves the sort of the national conversation and often the local conversation in the States at the moment. Do you have any, it's kind of happening at a time, as you say, where there are lots of different pressures on newsrooms. It feels perhaps like finally we're getting to the point where those dials might change. What do you think about that, though? Is this just do you think that we can actually really produce change in this cycle?
I do, in certain locations where individuals of color have a dynamic amount of power in a specific newsroom or specific location. So I would pose my example to that would be Philadelphia. You had a controversy with a headline that basically was a terrible headline that talked about, do buildings' lives matter?
Yes.
Journalists organized, and also different organizations organized, to the point where now you had a change in the executive editor, and you have an effort to enhance diversity in the newsroom. And this is an ongoing conversation that has spurred from the fact that you have a strong NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists chapter. You have lots of universities that are dealing with this. So you have this ecosystem with a large number of African Americans and also people who want to impact that type of change. And you see what happens there. You see significant change, and it's still going on. Take Pittsburgh, on the other hand. You have a situation where a reporter sent out a humorous tweet that maybe she shouldn't have done it, but it certainly wasn't the worst thing in the world. They were basically making a comparison to Kenny Chesney concerts in Pittsburgh. They get rowdy. She showed a photo of a Kenny Chesney concert and said, "Oh, this isn't a riot. This is a Kenny Chesney concert." Well, she was removed by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette for that tweet. And snowballing, and I could go into detail, basically at the end of this situation, another journalist of color has decided to leave the newspaper because they don't feel that it is an environment where they can work. And this reporter, Alexis Johnson, has decided to sue the newspaper.
Right.
And you had no movement from there. And I think that's a direct correlation to the degree of power and influence and within the city, the ecosystem itself, and that Philadelphia is a dynamic area where people and journalists of color have a lot of power, whereas Pittsburgh, it is a place where journalists of color are traditionally marginalized. So what I really would predict is that you're going to see changes in places like Los Angeles, in places like Philadelphia and New York, but in places where you don't have large, significant numbers of African Americans either in the community or in newsrooms, you won't see that type of change.
Right. Right, that's a really interesting point. I just wanted to come to Kyle. There's a lot there to unpack from what Letrell was saying. I think again it kind of speaks to this challenge of, you know, how much is this is kind of a system-wide problem that we can tackle, and how much of this is, you know, kind of just the actions of specific newsrooms or projects or what have you. And actually I've got a question from Jennifer Humke, who asks, and this is one I'm going to throw to you first, Kyle, which is, she says, "I'll be interested in hearing what each of the panelists view as the main principles of a high-functioning free press in today's world." And I think, you know, Letrell was just touching on the one there, which is you have to be in tune with your community to some extent. This is something that sort of CJR thinks a lot about. You know, if we're redrawing the founding principles of journalism, what should they be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the tone of this conversation is, I think, exactly where we need to be, and it's been a long time coming, because when you talk about what's happening on local news, and I agree with Heather that it's bad and it's even worse than we realize, because a lot of places that are open aren't really functioning newsrooms, and it's going to get worse. I think there's been a taboo in talking about how a lot of this isn't something we want to replace anyway. That's been something that we haven't really been allowed to say. And so we haven't really been allowed to point out, like, the fact that, you know, newsrooms in general in America have made very, very little progress in terms of the diversity of their workforces, and their the demographics of the newsroom are so often completely disconnected from the demographics of the community that they're supposed to be serving. And, you know, decade after decade after decade, this has been a problem. We've talked about this and nothing has changed. Now we have a moment where we can actually change it and do something about it, and not just rebuild the same places that we had before. Similarly with young readers, which has been a problem for newsrooms for ages. There's been a difficulty in writing and communicating with them in a way that sort of speaks to them. Similarly, the sort of digital expression of a lot of these local news outlets is terrible. Sorry, I just faded away. It's terrible, and this is something that hasn't really been fixed. So now we sort of have an opportunity, and this is what Heather was talking about there's an optimism here. We have an opportunity to sort of restart and rethink. And there's a tension, because a lot of the people who work in these places are seeing their jobs go away, and they're angry about that, understandably, and they're scared, understandably, and there's a lot of pressure to sort of to push that back as long as we can. Like, let's hold on to as many of these jobs as we possibly can now. And I think, and I totally understand that, and I think that's admirable, but I think that there is another conversation about, like, what if we have a blank slate and we can sort of rebuild this whole thing? To the question about what does that look like, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's somebody, I think it was, again, Heather talked about the power structure and what should to me, the question is, a functioning, vibrant newsroom is not within the power structure, it is outside of the power structure, and it's analyzing that and reporting on that and focusing on the deficiencies and really getting to like, how, you know, is your news organization writing about things that affect how I live and how my life could be lived better? I don't see a lot of that in the kind of daily coverage of city council meetings, but I think it's a sort of worldview of a kind of like, I wrote shortly after Trump came into office that we needed to sort of reclaim our role as malcontents as journalists, and that's a great organizing principle. So that's one of the ways I think about it.
Great. I just want to come to Elizabeth first, and then Heather, both of whom have something to say, I think, sort of on diversity. And also, if you can just pick up that question as well about, because I'm sure diversity is part of it, as what are the principles? You know, if we're going to do this thing, we need a constitution. And as Kyle says, you know, the constitution can't just be let's preserve jobs. Elizabeth.
I totally agree. I just wanted to say we need to change the ownership structures and the financial model of news if we're going to get the diversity in newsrooms, the inclusion in newsrooms, and the and serving of diverse audiences. I mean, it shouldn't be shocking, but it is always hard for me to hear when at Chalkbeat, where we serve primarily communities of color, where our bureaus are in 7 places around the country, where public education is in a time of a lot of transformative movement, that we talk to readers, we talk to families, we talk to parents, we talk to grandmothers, grandfathers, and they tell us over and over again, nobody from the Newark Star-Ledger, the Chicago Tribune, the Memphis Commercial Appeal ever came to me and asked me what my opinion was or what I wanted to hear or served me. And that shouldn't surprise us. One of the reporters on our team described working at, it was the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and that there was a matrix that they hung on the wall of what criteria did a story have to meet in order to get in the paper. And one of them was it had to be a story about an affluent community in Atlanta. And that makes perfect sense if you think about the advertising-based and subscription-based business model that prioritizes the highest paying customer for both advertisers and subscribers. I certainly experience incentives like that in newsrooms, and they're only exacerbated by having a lot of white people in the ownership and leadership of newsrooms who come from affluent backgrounds. And so in order to change this in a deep and permanent way, we have to change ownership. And I just was thinking about the examples of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette as a good example where the ownership is a big part of this story. And what does an ownership structure look like that does prioritize the democratic principles of serving, equipping all citizens with the information we need, all residents with the information we need to participate in the democracy. You know, that requires, to me, a non-commercial ownership structure and public support.
Sorry, Elizabeth, I didn't know whether you
that was my mic drop.
That's great. No, but your mic drop is so Heather. You have quite a lot to say on this.
There's so many things to say. I'm going to leave the ownership with you, Elizabeth. I agree so much. Let's talk about that some other time. I just want to say that I feel like so much of this comes back to what the free press is supposed to do. And the whole reason that you have a democracy instead of a monarchy or an autocracy or a feudal system is that you want some kind of playing field where the non-powerful are not just completely ripe for exploitation by the powerful. The free press is supposed to be the alarm system that warns us when that balance is getting out of tip, right? When would-be tyrants are coming in. So I would say if we were to have a capacity test for how well the free press is doing, that wasn't measuring the business success of the industry, but actually it's role in this larger democratic system, that we have failed entirely. Donald Trump is president, right? The free press has failed there. Income inequality is reaching levels that have rarely been seen before in this country. The rampant racism, the crumbling of the education system. We have not done our job in ringing the alarms around these things and helping people protect themselves from exploitation. So I think developing capacity tests for what success would look like is really, really important. And they have to be from the people's perspective. I notice how often these conversations are from the perspective of the newsroom, not of the people. And I also just want to say about, that so often diversity gets talked about as newsroom hiring policy, and it's so much bigger than that, that the key to a resilient system is diversity. That is how systems survive, and resilience is your ability to maintain your integrity in the face of trauma. I don't think it's a surprise that we haven't been resilient in the last 10 years when you look at all of the communities, for example, communities of color, that we've just abdicated responsibility over. I think that, sorry, I got sidetracked by Elizabeth's note that I shouldn't have said something about education.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. But I think this issue of diversity, it's not like, oh, let's have some better hiring policy. That's part of it. But this is really a much bigger issue about if we want a resilient system, one that can survive and fulfill its function, we have to build more pathways for more people and more different kinds of people, not to have the feeling as if they're participating, but to actually participate in the system. And what does that look like? And then just, I promise I'll stop, Emily, but the work that we've been doing around that is I really firmly believe that some of the answers to this are not going to be found in newsrooms, that along with the amazing work that Elizabeth is doing and John Thornton, and I know the Resolve people in Philly, that what do more informal networks look like? If the goal is that information and ideas are flowing in a diverse voices to diverse communities, how might we achieve that isn't going to be an institutional newsroom? And can we shift our model from being one of, I sometimes think of it as the difference between an oak tree and a dandelion. The newspaper is this big, grand oak tree. Well, you can cut down an oak tree, but if you've ever gardened, it's really hard to get rid of dandelions. Those guys just spring up between the cracks everywhere. So how do we become more of a dandelion model that to be more resilient? Sorry, that was kind of a rant, but.
No, that's okay. You broke my internet connection briefly, but I'm back now. So just because I'm a journalist, just kind of like, again, sort of focusing on that question, what I'm hearing is ownership and power and control of news organizations is critical. So to Jennifer's question about what are the principles of a vibrant and free operating press, part of it is that we need diversity of funding. We possibly need, Elizabeth, you said this needs to be done where profit is not the key motive. I'm going to kind of like put a pin in that because I think that's going to, that's really, there's a lot to talk about that. Letrell, on this kind of issue of principles, like what are the principles that we want to kind of employ to make this better? You've identified diversity, and I think you've identified it in the broad way that Heather was talking about, rather than the, kind of, it's just about hiring policy. It's about lots of different things. What are the other principles, that you would identify and say, we've got to have these if we are going to be successful in this mission?
Well, I think that first you have to make sure that you have connections, authentic, genuine connections to all segments of a particular population. And what that requires is, quite frank, and I agree with this, you can't just do the old school beat, send somebody off. You need to actually have, one of the things that, for instance, with the Germantown Info Hub, what we actually have done is we actually have somebody who is a community organizer, and this is something that a lot of places have been doing, where they just go off and they just talk to people. What's going on? And community engagement editors do some of this work. But the idea is just to talk to people and build up those relationships with people so that they trust you. And we can talk about trust in journalism and the decline of that for hours. But I think trying to say that here we are, what is it that we can do for you, and making it a two-way exchange. It can't just simply be top down, oh, this is what we think, and simply transactional. And that's one of the things that we've really attempted to do, is to really find out, okay, who in the community is being represented and who in the community is not being represented, and who aren't we necessarily connecting with. I think that has to be one of the foundational principles, is this idea of really engaging communities across the board as serving them as partners. So that's where I think one of the things that has to start is really emphasizing that particular issue. And certainly diversity is important, but let me make clear that it's not just enough to have diverse voices in there. You actually have to give people agency inside of newsrooms to express their voice. One of the big things that's going on is, for instance, and I think this is one of the things that needs to break down, this idea of objectivity. If you are hiring people, particularly people of color, to serve in your newsroom, and you are denying them their agency and their connection to a community and saying, no, you have to be objective and not say anything, which is exactly what happened in the Alexis Johnson case. Wesley Lowery wrote an excellent piece with the New York Times on this very piece. You have to give journalists the ability to be authentic in their voice in order to project stories. And it makes no sense to have people really covering different issues if they can't be honest and authentic with their voice. Otherwise, you're going to have a diverse newsroom where, because of the systems in place, you're still going to have production of the same types of narratives that are problematic. So I think that rethinking what it means to do journalism from a fairness and trust angle, that needs to go to the wayside. So that's something else that we really need to challenge as well.
I think that's a great point. Tom Rosenstiel did a very good thread on Twitter yesterday about how this kind of, and he was, Wesley kind of agreed with him as well, which is just the sort of the way that objectivity, objectivity should never mean what some newsrooms have turned it into. In other words, it should be your ability to see an object from all angles. It's not about this person can't report on that because, kind of perhaps the perspective they bring to it. But I think that's a really sort of critical point there. Kyle, do you, because Letrell's brought up the objectivity point, I'm going to get into some more. We've got some great questions coming in, so I'm going to turn to those in a minute. But I just wondered what your thoughts on that were, because for many years, CJR has been the bastion of criticising journalism and how we do it. What are your thoughts on the sort of this point about you have to change, or perhaps, bring back the actual original idea of objectivity as a kind of as a fairness test, rather than one of being kind of disinterested or demonstrably disinterested?
Yeah, I mean, we institutionally sort of abandoned the idea of being this kind of central ground a long time ago. I mean, we're quite clear to our writers that we are hiring them because we want to hear what they have to say, and we want them to use their voice to say it. I think this is an example of a generational divide that, frankly, again, I think is much more prevalent at the local level than elsewhere. That's just my reading of it. But I think it's always been. I mean, Emily, you know this world much better than I do, but I've always been a fan of the British press, which is much more free about this sort of thing. And I've always thought that the idea that you have people who.
I want to know what Emily's thinking right now.
I was going to say, it depends on, all I'm going to say is it depends.
Well, what I was going to say is that, like, this idea that you can somehow divorce how you feel about something from the work that you do has always been a lie. And readers always knew it was a lie. And so to try to keep that going seemed like, has for me, for quite a long time, it seemed like a very bad idea. And it seems like it feeds this notion that there's a paternalism to it. There's an idea that, well, readers aren't going to see through that when they absolutely do. So I think this move that we're making is exactly the right direction, and it's overdue.
Can you say why? Can I ask a question? Can you say,
Of course.
Why did you say that you think it's more prevalent at the local level? Generational divide.
Well, I think one of the reasons is that the managements at the local level tend to be a little bit older. That's my experience. Again, if we're talking about sort of mid-sized local newspapers that are legacy print newspapers, I mean, it's a very unscientific reading, but a lot of it is based on the kind of emails that we get, because we have a lot of those people at CJR as our readers, and they're having a particularly hard time. What's that?
Reporters and editors at regional newspapers.
I'm talking about more editors than reporters. Do you disagree?
I haven't seen evidence of that personally, and I guess my personal bias is the opposite, that I think sometimes there's like when a lot of local issues, some of the national conversation about this often is about political bias.
Yeah.
But I think on local issues, political ideology is so much more muddied, because it's like you're much more confronted by the nuances of how things work in reality. I do think certainly like how we report on crime needs, that is a very local problematic changed issue.
Yeah, but I think that's one of the areas where it really comes to the fore when you write about crime, when you write about policing at the local level, when you write about race, especially now at the local level. That's where you really see these tensions.
I just want to cut that. I just want to sort of get to some of the questions, though. I think that there's some fascinating stuff there that actually comes up in a couple of things that people are asking. I'm going to ask us all a very uncomfortable question. Well, it's uncomfortable for me and Heather, which is from Barbara Solo, who says, what role can journalism schools play to push this important conversation about what the future needs to look like, breaking the taboo that you just mentioned about preserving the existing system? I know that Elizabeth, when I asked Elizabeth what we should be doing, she had a very radical suggestion which would put me out of work, but it was quite a good one. So I'm going to come to her first, and then Heather and Letrell, we're all in the same boat. We're teaching communications and journalism, so this is our problem too. Elizabeth, what should we be doing?
I told Emily I think journalism schools should shut down for the next 3 years, and stop, at least stop admitting students, and instead consider just fully locking arms with those of us in the field trying to rebuild and just both bring down and bring up. So that was my, take all those resources. It does a great job fundraising for the schools, and let's fundraise for something different. I mean, Letrell, it sounds like you are a practitioner and a scholar at the same time. And that was my obnoxious thing I said to Emily in private that you're now making me say in public.
Well, I thought it was a really, I think it's not going to happen. So that's one thing. But it's a thought experiment, that thing which says, well, actually, we're all graduating young people into the field every year. This year, it's going to be tough. Are we doing? But actually, at the core of that, it's not frivolous. It's this issue about, are we teaching people the right things? Are we working with the field in the right way to change things? And are we kind of sure that we know what the end product, in other words, do we know what we should be orienting our students to do, and does that show up in our curricula? Letrell, what are your views about how we can help in institutions of learning?
I think the first thing is we have to be honest with our students and saying that, and this requires being honest with ourselves, that I tell students what we're teaching you now is not going to be relevant 5 minutes from now. And I think that what we really need to emphasize are it should be in a lab. I mean, I actually, in my classes, we experiment a lot with okay, a lot of engagement. We're going out and just talking to people and meeting as many people as possible. We experiment with tabling and things of that nature, and we talk a lot about collaboration. But I think that what it's going to require, quite frankly, is, if you're being honest, a lot of the old school journalists that are pushing these old school ideas need to take early buyouts, maybe, because what they're doing is a disservice in trying to hold up this mantle of what journalism was, when in reality, that's not what it should be, and it's not what it's going to be in the future. So I think that we really need to start embracing a lot of the more alternative ideas that are coming up from younger journalists and from younger academics that are related to collaboration, solutions, engagement, advocacy in some cases, speaking, using your authentic voice, and just come up with a completely new model for how to train journalists who are coming up the ranks. And will that happen anytime soon? I don't think that I don't see that happening. I think that, and that's going to not just have to happen in university. It's going to have to happen with a lot of the organizations. I'll just simply say that NABJ, NAHJ came up with their list of panels that they're doing for their national conference, and I'll just simply say that it looks outdated to me. So it's not just in the academy.
Right. Heather, older academics, we should take buyouts. You're muted.
Sorry, I had already. I think my perspective is a little bit different. I started J&D 5 years ago. We don't have a legacy. I don't think of what we do as being preparing future professional journalists. Some people will go on, but there aren't any jobs left. What I think of us as doing is basic civic literacy. I've discovered over the years, now that thousands of students have gone through our program, and we also create open source materials that we provide for community colleges, so lots and lots of students have access to our pedagogy and our curriculum. How empowering students find journalism education, that you have the right to ask a hard question of people in power, even if they don't want you to ask it, that you have to know who your community is and what their needs are and how you help meet those needs, telling stories, distinguishing between good information and bad. I increasingly over the years think of journalism education as almost a Trojan horse, that really what we're doing is constituency building and a long game, which is, can we help the next generation be prepared to fight for the kind of free press we need and the kind of media policy that we need? Because the reality is there aren't jobs for the students. I mean, a few of them will, but every year it's less and less. I think that the journalism education, at least the way we do it, which every class starts with the 20th century newspaper model, is just one manifestation of an idea. The idea is the free press. This is why we have it. This is how it's manifested over time. What should it be going forward? That's what we're asking our students to think about. We're through the work that we do, open sourcing and creating curricular and pedagogical materials, we're also trying to transfer our status to other communities. So we do a lot of systems thinking, helping people unpack really complex topics. We do a lot of design process, and these tend to be really privileged areas of study. And so we feel like if we're helping bring these into communities that would not usually have access, we're part of the solution.
I have to say that, you know, listening to you, Heather, I think that you know, we're a professional school at Columbia. We teach people to go out and report, but you're absolutely spot on, you know, we need a high level of literacy around the function of information creation, sharing, consumption, and that actually, you know, I think the heroes of our age are high school newspaper or journalism programs that actually kind of like start to engage communities, and you can report on your community. I know that, you know, kind of community colleges, Heather, is something you've talked a lot about in the past.
Well, this is what I was going to say. I mean, everything I'm saying is going back to this: stop focusing on the newsroom. The future is not going to be in the newsroom. That's part of the future, but it's not it entirely. That even this conversation has ended up being about what happens in newsrooms as they exist now and have existed. If we can break our habit of thinking about that and truly understand that the problem we're working on is how to gather information, how to process it, and how to distribute it. It's a totally different problem with different solutions. So empowering people of all different kinds of people across the country to be knowing how to do this, new systems are going to emerge. It's not about coming up with a new model so much. This is my corner of the space. I shouldn't be making these grand claims. What I'm working on is not trying to build a new model, but trying to say, what are the conditions that new models will emerge? How do we empower as many people as possible to feel that they know how to participate? And then what happens once people feel empowered like that? That can be a really transformative thing.
I want to conflate a couple of questions here because they're sort of taking us, I think, in a direction that the conversation has already started to get going. One is about polarization, which is something we hear a lot about, and polarization of the press. Something that we're studying is just how dark money in local news, when advertising disappears, becomes this force for kind of political polarization. And this idea again of Angela Woodall, who's a PhD student, whose name I recognize, it says, you know, this idea of the authentic voice, and it's a longish question, so I'm going to try and summarize, which is really sort of saying, you know, can journalists accept an authentic voice that prioritizes ideology, or does that just not share the values that a journalist thinks others should share? So in other words, it's sort of a similar question about, you know, how, is there something we should be thinking about polarization? You know, Heather's saying, let's not start with the newsroom, but often kind of, you know, these problems show up in the newsroom. So Letrell, you know, when we're talking about, you know, authenticity, I think you kind of pretty much answered Angela's point by saying not only can you accept authentic voices, you should do, but the question of ideologies, you know, how do we navigate that? Is that something we can leave behind in the 20th century, or is that as everything is politicized, it seems that we are probably just going to have to deal with that more rather than less?
During one of my interviews, focus groups in Chambersburg, Central Pennsylvania, one of the African Americans that I interviewed or spoke with said that we need journalists who are advocates for our community. And that was because of the years of disenfranchisement that particular neighborhood or community has experienced. You need people to come in and tell the story of that neighborhood and really rally behind those individuals in telling those types of stories. And from my perspective, that's what I think a lot of journalism was, and certainly in the 1800s, where you actually did have much more partisan journalism, and this idea of being balanced and objective wasn't necessarily even thought of as something that should even happen. And I think that really, if you have people who are truthfully, I mean, you certainly need to have, everything should be based in truth and fact, but if you have people who are saying, I'm going to write these stories that talk about solutions to this problem, that are going to profile good things that are happening in this neighborhood, that are going to tell a different story or different perspective, I think that that's positive. And I think that I don't see a problem with that. And I think that particularly for a lot of traditionally marginalized communities, you need people who are going to step in and say, look, I'm here to write about this community, and we will talk about its faults. But as an advocate, I also need to be somebody who's going to talk about all of its gems. And I think that that's something that newsrooms or whatever the model that needs to happen, because the model right now basically privileges people who are in power and marginalizes other voices for the sake of being fair or objective.
I wonder, can I
Sure.
just quickly, I'm sorry, because the question earlier about like what would a list of a healthy system, I think this issue of being an advocacy for your community is really key, and not to be mistaken for partisanship. It's just, I think you said it really eloquently, Letrell, what I was trying to say earlier about is your allegiance to powerful or to people in their communities, and how do we flip that? I'm always struck that when I teach the rise of the Black press in one of my classes, that it's just straight from the beginning, we're advocates for our community. Like, what else would we be? And you see the resilience of the Spanish language press, Emily, you and I have talked about this in this country, that people still call the Spanish language press when the immigrants still do when they have a problem, because there's still those bonds of trust, because there's a sense that the newspapers are their advocates. And I don't think it's that surprising that our newspapers have not shown the resilience they could have in the last 10 years. It's because people know they're not their advocates.
I just wanted to kind of sort of bring it back down to, as it were, you know, the practicalities of this, and perhaps bring Elizabeth and Kyle in on this one as well, because I've got a question from Casey Connors, who says, our only state newspaper in Hawaii, the Star Advertiser, has just announced it's laying off half its staff, 30 reporters. Hawaii is so corrupt. In our other online newspaper, Civil Beat, has no Hawaiian reporters still. Our rural communities in Hawaii are using our community Facebooks, but we don't have access like journalists do. And this is kind of so when it comes back to let's rethink things outside the newsroom, I think one of the big questions that I have, and I'm going to point this at you, Elizabeth, is, you know, a little bit like using an unfortunate parallel here, but, you know, kind of other civic services like fire, police, etc. You know, do communities deserve professional reporters? You know, that to me seems like a really big question, because if you talk to the, you know, Googles and the Facebooks, they'll go, hey, you can have a community group, you can have automated content that covers all of these things, but that on the ground in your community reporter or newsroom, what, you know, I'm asking you to advocate.
What we value, you know,
yeah,
like if we
advocate for the newsroom.
Obviously I agree with you. Yes. Or I agree with the implication that, yeah, communities deserve that. Like, democracy can't function without it. And we have just not at all in any way, I think, articulated that journalism is a public good. We really just haven't. But it's this ridiculous, like, contradiction sitting right in front of us. You know, like, I have a 1-year-old kid and I read him a good night story, and it's like the 3 branches of government go through the book, and there's like, here's the president and his helicopter, and here's the lawmakers making their laws, and here's the court doing justice, and the next page is, and here's the reporters telling the news to the world. And I read that page to him and I'm like, but they are not supported by any public infrastructure in this country. And I think he really understands that that's wrong. So
I was going to say, that's a kind of like, that's some pretty heavy bedtime reading you get involved there. But this is so let's sort of pick up, because we're a little bit over time, so if I can just indulge you and just hold you, just if you're all okay to go over for just a couple of minutes, I want to kind of wrap up on this idea, Elizabeth, that you brought up right at the top, which is moment of hope, exciting, good political moment, perhaps, to really force change. And I think we all feel that, but so far, the kind of mechanics of what does that look like are still pretty vague. You know, what's the work that we have to do to get to turning, you know, this conversation into actual kind of outcomes, into jobs and infrastructure? Kyle, you've unmuted yourself in a...
Sure. I mean, we've avoided this subject so far in this conversation, but ultimately we are going to have to talk about money. And we're going to have to talk about sort of where the funding is going to come from. I think it was Elizabeth who said, or maybe I'm mistaken, maybe it was Heather, who said that a lot of this is going to have to be formed as a nonprofit. But I also think it's related to this question of creating a demand from the public, creating a sense of like, if we want journalism in our community, it's something we have to pay for. It's a argument that National Public Radio has been making, that, you know, it's like, you can get it for free, but if you value it, you have to pay for it. And, you know, until fairly recently, that's been that's been an ask that most news organizations have been uncomfortable in making. And I still even find the ones who are doing it, it's a little bit restrained. But I think that that's the case we need to make. Like, if you view us as your fire department or your water service or your sort of essential services, but There's been a few cases around the country where wealthy local people, not wealthy, but local people who have some means have sort of seen that and have realized like, hey, having a functioning, healthy local press is as important to our community as having good parks or a great museum or a good public school system. And they sort of have stepped up and they've sort of gotten other people involved. And we're not seeing enough of that, but I think that's what's ultimately going to have to happen. I think the sort of, just one more thought, I just think that this kind of like private equity, hedge fund, sort of chain ownership is not working and is not going to get us anywhere we need to be. And nor is the sort of single ultra wealthy benefactor a model that is going to get us where we need to be. So it's one of these other things that's going to have to work.
Elizabeth, you brought up the ugly business of money, and also you are working on, what the actual practical kind of, day to day of a plan that would address this.
Yes. Yeah. We need to advocate, to use that word. We need to advocate and get all the effing money that we can from every place that will provide it in support of independent journalism. So
is there a policy bit to this? If there's a change in the White House in November, is there any point in going to central government and saying, if you don't want this to keep happening, you're going to have to build differently?
We are doing that. There's many advocacy coalitions that exist on behalf of the legacy media and on behalf of the future. There's a little coalition of us doing our part to tell the members of Congress that we need to support journalism. And there's lots of different specific ways that we've suggested doing that. So I think it's talking to state, local, and federal elected officials about this, and also talking to our colleagues to just and communities to get everyone understanding of why that matters, why it's possible to do in a way that's not a propaganda arm, and how do we do that. And then it's also talking to private philanthropy, because I also, like Kyle, don't love the idea of, well, I'm not sure, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I don't love the idea of a benevolent, usually white male savior to owner model. I don't think that's going to work. We can't rely on single individuals. We need more accountable and diverse structures. And I think that means, nonprofits that take many rich white men's money and pour it into good, but hopefully also, as much community accountability baked in as well, to a new press, just a new press that is in service.
And what about scale in all of this? So we've talked about things being kind of distributed. We've talked about grassroots things. Good question from Lauren Harris here, just saying, how do you scale some of these things when you're talking about kind of scaling communities, etc.? Is it necessary, or do we have to kind of rethink that as well?
I have a strong opinion that we absolutely need to think about scale, otherwise we're really even more screwed than we thought we were, because the scale of the problem is gigantic. I mean, the scale of the problem is roughly, by our calculations at AJP, about $1 billion a year annually missing that should be spent on news gathering in exactly the kinds of ways that everyone here is describing what it looks like what Letrell is describing, what the rural and urban communities need. It costs money at scale, so we need to have problems at scale. Does that mean that it's going to be like the same as the hedge fund owned corporate networks that are not actually have roots in communities and to which they are not accountable to communities? No, it's possible to do solutions at scale that are deeply anchored and accountable, I think, and we just have to.
Right. Letrell.
I think that one of the things that's happened, as I mentioned with Philadelphia, and then the truth is that the foundations have poured a lot of money into a lot of good journalism efforts in Philadelphia. I do think that there's a place for foundations to continue to support up good journalism. In Pittsburgh, arguably one of the best operations right now is Public Source, which is a nonprofit news operation. And they've, for instance, they've covered communities of color there very aggressively. And the last several hires they've made have been African American. So I think that that's something that certainly should be considered. But again, everything's going to have to be scaled to particular communities, because what's working in Philadelphia isn't necessarily going to work in Pittsburgh, and it certainly isn't going to in Pennsylvania, where you don't have that same amount of money or revenue for foundations. So I think that that's why this is going to get really, this is a complicated situation, and I think that you need to look at, I honestly think there need to be mixed models in terms of funding.
Yeah, I think that kind of, I agree with you that plurality is something we often don't talk about anymore, because, you know, kind of it feels like any model, anything that pays for journalism. But, you know, one of the things that has drained out of the free press in the past few years has just been the idea that we should be building policies and funding models that are genuinely pluralistic. So we really do need public support, and maybe we do really need philanthropic support, and, you know, then there is always going to be kind of things that succeed commercially, and we don't need to worry about those so much. So Heather, kind of maybe kind of last word to you on this, about like, what about the money, and how do we start to advocate for this in a more effective way?
Yeah, I mean, I think Elizabeth is totally right. I mean, I think Victor Picard says $150 per person would basically, but that, of course, I never excelled at math. It's $1 billion or 1.5 billion a year. I mean, I guess I would just say to what Kyle was saying, a point I find myself making a lot is, and Emily, I think you and I were talking about this, is people have to want it. So we have not done a good enough job of explaining how this is a public health issue, and that that it's not just about journalist jobs, but it's something that the public needs. And I think that rethinking of it like that for ourselves, and then communicating it better, it has to be the first step of anything. I also think not being naive about the interests out there who don't want a functioning free press is important. When you talk about the federal government right now, you know, it is not, right now, the information systems existing as they do are certainly in some people's benefit. So, you know, this is not just a given that everybody wants what we're saying we want. And three, I think it has to start locally. I don't see this coming from the federal government.
That's a great place to end. When I say it's a great place to end, actually I could have this conversation with everybody here. I'm sorry, there are some questions we didn't quite get to, but I might see if I can kind of pitch those to our panelists and put them in our newsletter, which wraps this up. I mean, one thing I do think is just that it is so great having people like you three in this space, to not just kind of like go out there and talk to these communities, but also propose solutions. So that gives me a great deal of hope. I want to thank everybody who's participated in these panels, particularly our panelists today. Sign up for our newsletter. We're at Tau Center on Twitter. You can visit us at the CJR website. CJR now has a great newsletter, which is the Journalism Crisis newsletter, which is flagged on the front of the site, no doubt, Kyle, and sign up for that as well, because this tackles some of the issues that we're seeing during the pandemic, but goes to the issues of solutions in the future. With that, it's my wedding anniversary, so I should probably log off. This is what happens when you've been married for 26 years. It's like one of you is writing it. Actually no. So one of us is writing a newsletter and the other of us is on a webinar. But anyway, I hope everybody else has a safe and happy week. And do get in touch with CJR or the Tau Center if you have ideas about this, if you want to contribute, and if you think that there are things that we are not thinking about that we should be thinking about, our DMs are always open for your ideas. So again, I cannot thank you enough, guys. Thanks so much.